Yeah, thanks, Mandy. Yeah, as Ashley said, droughts aren't a new thing. We've had a couple of droughts in the last sort of decade. This is making the third one, and our observation after bad droughts has been that farmers that have acted quickly, reduced stock numbers, have come out the other end looking best. So that's been our sort of general recommendation: act quickly, reduce your flock in a timely manner, and if you've got an exit strategy like Ashley outlined, even better. But what I want to talk about today is how this 2017 drought is sort of turning out, or is looking different than the others. And really, there's three things that are different. The first is that as Ashley pointed out, the market conditions are much better at the moment. We're looking at record profitability for sheep. If you look at nominal, it's at much higher levels than the normal, but even if you look at the sort of CPI adjusted, it's still the second highest profitability we've had for sheep for the last 30 years. So things are good for sheep. There's much more incentive or much more price incentive to keep animals on farm. The second are that there's more sale options available for livestock and stores. So Ashley talked about the air freight lamb market that's a relatively new thing. That's an option for selling lighter lambs that didn't used to exist. There's also, and it's probably associated with the high price, there's a reasonable market for livestock to the eastern states. So what that means is that a bit of that pressure to act quickly is reduced, because it would seem that the market is not going to collapse like it has in previous droughts, where if you didn't sell now, next week was too late. That looks like it's not going to be the case, or at least as badly the case this time as it has been in the past. And the third thing is that we're also a little bit more sophisticated in how we can calculate what are the priority sheep. We know more about the effects of nutrition on ewes, particularly through the Lifetime Wool project, which is being rolled out as Lifetime Ewe Management. We have a much better handle on what's the impact of reducing nutrition to ewes, and we can start putting some values on, or is it better to maintain? Is it what's the cost of losing weight? What about having your ewes gain weight if you're having to feed grain? We can start putting some numbers that we can hang our hat on some of those things, and we just didn't have the data to be able to do that in the past. So a bit of a summary about what's required is, and the sort of what Ashley's been talking about, the decision process that farmers need to follow. Well, first of all, sell the low priority stock, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but basically what Ashley covered with his slide. Then retain the medium and high priority sheep and feed them. And Ashley did some sums, and I've done some sums looking at, well, what can we afford to feed? How long can we keep? How long can we afford to keep sheep? And so I want to run through some of that. And then if you're lucky enough to have some spring feed available or some stubbles post-harvest, what are the priority sheep to utilise that scarce spring feed? Prioritising spring feed is not something we normally have to do. Normally there's more than enough to go around, and we just put out everything that wants to gain weight. This year is likely to be different, so what is the priority? Which sheep are going to give you the best bang for your buck for that spring feed, if you're lucky enough to have some? And then the last area I want to look at is the stuff I've looked at under those first sort of three headings. If you're in the situation where you've got access to and can afford to buy sufficient grain to do what you want, what is profitable to do with your sheep. So if it gives you a return on your money, you've you've got access to the grain to do it. But that's not the case for everybody, and as Ashley said, if you're going to have a sheep in a feedlot for an extended period of time, you're looking at sort of potentially up to 200 kilos, 250 kilos of supplement. So there's a lot of money required in order to feed your sheep if they're going to be in the feedlot for a long period of time. So what happens if cash flow is restricted, or if grain price is higher? So I want to spend a little bit of time looking at that. So selling the low priority stock. This is a copy of Ashley's heading and of Ashley's slide, and I agree with that those 2.5, 3.5-year-old ewes are your high priority stock. They are easy to look after. They're going to produce you a lamb, and that's good value. They're also producing a good wool clip. The maidens aren't quite such a high priority because they generally have a slightly lower lambing percentage. Your mature ewes, 4.5-year-old, as Ashley said, they do produce a lot of lambs, and they're producing twins, so that's technically more difficult to manage, but they've also got less life left ahead of them. So if you're starting to look into the future, those 4.5-year-old ewes have only got sort of 1-2 lambs left, whereas your maidens have got multiple lambs in their lifetime. So that's why the mature ewes are slightly lower priority. The ewe lambs, again, not going to give you a lamb next year, and more expensive to look after, so a lower priority. And then the wether lambs, or the wether hoggets, are the lowest priority. A little bit of extra detail to add over that is if you've got some ewes that you're not planning on mating next year. So Ashley talked about if you're in a situation where you've got no paddock feed and aren't looking like you're going to have any paddock feed through till the break next year, and you normally lamb before the break, your only option is either to lamb in a feedlot or not to mate. Now, if you're not mating, that puts those ewes down near the bottom of the list as far as the priority sheep to keep. So maybe the decision is if you're not planning to, or if you're in a situation where you've got no feed and you'd have to be lambing in a feedlot, don't mate, don't keep, like sell those sheep. That looks, if sheep aren't a priority part of your business, then again, selling sheep becomes a better issue. Keeping sheep is a lower priority. The other overlay to put over these groups is the condition score of the sheep. Ashley talked about the tail and managing that tail, and that's important in confinement, but it's also important in allocating the feed to the sheep. The skinny sheep are a high priority for feeding, but they're a low priority for keeping. But if you keep them, they're a high priority to feed. Perhaps you're best off not to keep them. So that becomes part of the decision-making process about where the cut-offs are to which sheep to keep, which sheep to sell. Probably should go back. The sums that Ashley's talked about, and that I've done some as well, we can afford to keep ewes in a feedlot for 365 days, lamb them in the feedlot, feed them the full ration, and the profitability, allowing for some deaths in the feedlot, allowing for some husbandry costs, the cost of the grain and the husbandry is offset by the value of the lamb and the value of the wool that the sheep grows. So at the moment, a sort of rough rule of thumb is you're getting about a half or a bit more than half of the value of the grain that you're feeding a sheep at maintenance, you're getting back in wool cut, provided you've got a merino and not a shedding breed. But for a reasonable merino operation, you're getting at least half the value of your grain back in wool. And then you've got the other half is coming from the lamb. So it's reasonably easy to do those calculations and show that that the value of the wool and the lamb offsets the cost of the grain. And the profit that you make is what I'm calling the rebuilding margin. So sheep, if you've destocked your farm, then sheep will be more valuable for you next year than they are this year. And so what I'm calling the rebuilding margin is the increase in value of stock next year compared with this year. So most people would think about what I've put on as the second point on the graph, but I think the first point is more important. If you've sold down some of your flock this year, so you've sold those low priority classes, the dry sheep, the younger ewes perhaps, then essentially you're understocked next year, and that makes more stock next year more valuable. Example you can think about there is normally an operation has to sell their surplus young ewes because there's not enough space on the farm to keep them, whereas if you're lightly stocked or you're understocked compared with where you'd like to be, then you could keep those cull young ewes, cull ewe hoggets, and make them to a terminal sire, cut some wool, get a crossbred lamb, and then sell the ewe at the end of that year instead of selling her at the beginning of the year. So that's what I'm calling the rebuilding margin, and the calculations that we've done show that can be sort of $40 per head, even if prices don't go up. So if you've got a lower stocking rate than you'd like, then extra sheep on the farm are sort of $40 per head more valuable than you would normally think of them. So this rebuilding margin is quite important, and the second part of it is that after a drought, supply of sheep onto the market is lower because people are retaining more of their animals, and demand is higher because some of the people who sold their flock down are wanting to buy breeders back in again. So we would expect to see prices in the sale yards increase next year. But even if they don't, there's still the rebuilding margin from point one. So if you've got your ewes in a feedlot for the 12 months, then the profit you're making is really what I'm calling the rebuilding margin, because the costs are covered by the sale lamb or the lamb that you've produced and the wool. But the rebuilding margin will be lower for people who've got alternative land use, that they can say, okay, well, I'm not actually understocked because I've increased my crop area. Now, if that's an option for people, then that means that rebuilding margin's not as large. But my observation has been that a lot of people have increased their crop area a lot over the last few years, and so there's a question as to whether you can profitably increase it even further if you sell down your sheep flock. The rebuilding margin is also less for farmers who, as Ashley says, that sheep aren't a core part of their business, which means that the rebuilding margin is larger if sheep are a core part of your business. So if you're focused on your sheep enterprise and you're making profit and you see that that's a good part of your business, then keeping this rebuilding margin in mind as part of your calculations on profitability is important. So that's the first part. So if it is profitable, or if it can be profitable to keep sheep in a well-run confinement operation, and a well-run confinement operation is not the one that's losing 22%, it's the one that's losing 2 to 3%, then what are the priorities to feed? And I've put a return on investment for the extra feed that's required. And ewes that are in condition score less than 2.3, I've said that if they're down in that sort of condition score now, they are a high risk. If you choose to retain those ewes, they're a high risk for mating, because if you mate them, then the death rates for those ewes will be much higher. We've got data on that shows quite a good relationship between condition score and death rate. condition score getting below 2.5, death rate of the ewe, condition score 2.5 at lambing, death rate of the ewes starts to increase. So there's an animal welfare issue mating below condition score 2.3. There's also a profit issue mating at condition score below 2.3. So it's feeding those ewes to gain weight, to be above that cut-off for mating is a high priority use of your supplement. And it gives you a return on investment of somewhere around 500%. Depends a little bit on what condition they start in and how much you need to feed in order to get over the cut-off, but it's a big number. Which is saying that it can pay to feed sheep to gain weight to have a lamb. It can also pay to feed sheep that are in condition score 2.5, so you're going to make them and get a moderate lambing percentage. You can afford to feed them up to gain 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 of a condition score and get 5 or 10% more lambs in confinement. That will pay. So if they're in confinement already, it'll pay to feed those ewes to gain weight to be at a slightly better target condition at joining. So these are some of the calculations we can do using the lifetime ewe management data, and so we can be fairly certain that this is the case. We know the response to extra condition score at joining on scanning percentage. We know the effects of condition score at joining and live weight change during pregnancy on birth weight, and we know the effects of birth weight on lamb survival. So we're pretty certain that we can estimate the effects of feeding in that lead up to joining and through pregnancy on what's going to happen to your number of lambs weaned, and lambs weaned turns into profit. So that's a new message that feeding grain to sheep to gain weight is profitable, and it's different this year because of the high prices, and it's different because of that rebuilding margin. If it wasn't for those, then we'd have our standard lifetime ewe management message, which is it pays to maintain sheep with grain, it doesn't pay to put weight on sheep with grain. So this is a slightly different message than the lifetime ewe management message. But if ewes are in condition score 3, then it doesn't pay to gain weight, it only pays to maintain weight, and your return on investment for maintaining weight for those condition score 3 animals is about 50% return on investment. So that's a reasonably solid return, and this is working on sort of $350 a tonne for grain, which seemed like a reasonable number when I did the calculations, but as actually observed, prices are starting to move, so that's starting to squeeze that 50% return. So moving on, for the groups that are or the areas that are lucky enough to have a bit of spring feed, I've done some looking at, well, what's the priorities for allocating that scarce feed. Normally there's enough to go round. This year there's probably not. And again, if you've kept your ewes that are too thin to mate, they're the highest priority. The last slide was sort of saying, okay, that's about a 500% return on investment. This is looking at it in a slightly different way, saying, well, how much in dollars per kilo do you gain by having those animals gain the weight rather than a different group of animals gain the weight on your pasture feed? So these ewes are sort of turning that extra feed into profit at about $15 per kilo of live weight. So I did that calculation saying, well, if they're currently in, say, 2.1, so you're not going to mate them, you add 0.4 of a condition score, take them up to 2.5, so that's our mateable condition. How much feed does that require? You now get a lamb and the wool versus only getting the wool before. So that's how you get the $15 a kilo. It's actually $60 a head, but you've put on 4 kilos, so that's $15 a kilo. So again, it's really just saying it's a big number. If you only had to put on a smaller amount, then it's a bigger number. If you have to put on a bigger amount, then it's a lower number. But it's still a long way ahead of sort of number 2, sitting at $2.90 a kilo. So number 2 is stands for merino ewes mated to a merino ram, because that was the other thing I forgot to mention about the merino ewe mated to a merino ram. In the rebuilding margin that I talked about, a merino ewe mated to a terminal sire doesn't get that rebuilding margin because you don't keep the crossbred lamb to rebuild your flock. They're sold sort of by definition. So the merino operation gets the rebuilding margin. The merino terminal sire operation doesn't get the rebuilding margin. It only gets a potential increase in value of the stock. Like merino ewes to buy in might be more expensive next year. So if you're wanting to make them to a terminal sire, you're going to have to pay more for them, and that's a bigger cost to your business, i.e. keeping those ewes is of some higher value. But for the merino, you get that plus the extra rebuild margin. So therefore, the merino ewes are a higher priority. And at condition score 2.5, especially if they had twins last year, because that is likely to give you, they're more likely to give you a lamb again next year. And the maidens, because the maidens tend to be poorer mothers than the older ewes. So if you've got that maiden ewe in better condition at lambing, she's probably going to give you a slightly better bang for your buck than getting an older ewe in slightly better condition at lambing. So that's something we can't put sort of solid numbers on. It's just an observation and a feeling that's the case. A merino ewe in condition score 3, she'll give you about $2.40 a kilo, and that's equivalent to a merino to terminal sire ewe in about condition score 2.5. So and they're returning $2.40. Something to think about here in relation to the value of ewes in different condition score. The calculations have been done on the value of an extra kilo of live weight on that class of sheep. And we would tend to expect that when you've got a certain amount of high quality feed in the paddock, that the skinny ewe will turn that into live weight more effectively than a fat ewe will turn that into extra live weight. So what that means is that these numbers, the $2.90 and the $2.40, will probably actually be spread apart if we'd done the calculation on the value of the feed rather than the value of the live weight that the feed is turned into. But I hadn't got that far, and it was partly because there's a lot of things that determine how's that extra kilo going to get turned into live weight, which is really what's the availability of that feed, and it was all too hard, so it didn't happen. The fourth group as priority was fattening cast for age ewes post weaning for sale. So that normally happens is you put post weaning, you put your ewes back out onto the spring flush. They gain weight for a while, then you sell them. But that process is the lowest priority of the sheep that could gain weight this spring. That's not one of them, and that's sort of equivalent to the merino ewe being mated to a terminal sire who's currently in condition score 3. That's also a low priority use of your feed. 5, okay. So to put this into some context, a tonne of high quality green feed could probably achieve about 150 kilos of live weight gain. So if you're selling that down here, 150, that's sort of $300 worth of value here. Take it up there, you're getting closer to $450 worth of value, and allocate it up here and you're getting something closer to $2,000 worth of value. So we're talking about sort of hundreds of dollars per tonne of feed in your paddock if you allocate it well versus allocating it badly. So what about in a situation if, because all those calculations were done assuming that you can access the grain and you've got the money to do it, what are you going to get a return on spending the money? Like, is it profitable? But it might still be profitable, but you just can't do it because you can't access the grain, either because it's not out there or because you haven't got any money in the bank to buy it. How do you allocate the feed then? And the return on asset, return on investment starts becoming more important rather than just is it profitable or not, is which is the most profitable. So feeding for maintenance, return on investment 50%, feeding for live weight gain, even for the high priority sheep for live weight gain, was only a return on investment of 40%. So feeding you'll use for maintenance becomes more important than feeding those condition score 2.5 ones up for extra lambs. And also I've worked out the break-even prices. So this is what happens if grain prices are higher. When do you stop feeding for live weight gain? When do you stop feeding for maintenance? So at live weight gain, 3.3 cents per megajoule. So that's somewhere $450 per tonne for lupins, 3.8 cents per megajoule. That's somewhere just a bit over $500 per tonne for lupins. So that's saying even at $500 a tonne you can still afford to maintain your fat sheep and definitely maintain your thinner sheep. But the other question is, well, if you've only got a fixed amount of grain available that you can access, are you better off to have more sheep losing weight or less sheep maintaining weight? And that comes down to how long you're going to have the sheep in confinement for. If it's a short-term confinement, then it's better off to have more sheep losing weight slowly, because that saving in kilos per head is a relatively higher proportion of your total grain, because you're not doing maintenance for a long period. Whereas if you're doing maintenance for a long period, there's a lot of grain there, and the little bit you save by letting them lose weight is offset by the numbers that you can carry. And it's a pretty rough calculation, but because there's a lot of things that affect it, but it's about 9 months in the feedlot. You're better off to, beyond 9 months in the feedlot, you're better off to maintain, and that'll be more profitable than allowing slow weight loss. It also turns out that's a pretty sensible thing to do, because if you're going to have a long period in the feedlot, you probably don't know how long it's going to be. So if you're letting them lose weight, and it gets longer and longer, and you lose weight, and it gets longer and longer, and you lose weight, then you're going to end up in trouble. So if your target is maintenance, then you can stay in that feedlot for as long as it has to be. So with those targets, this is sort of reiterating what Ashley's saying, if you've got those targets, you need to calculate how much, if you're in this situation where you've got limited availability of funds, you need to calculate how many sheep you can afford to feed, because you don't want to have them in there for 9 months and then say, oh, I've run out of money now, but you haven't really done, a half-done job is not going to pay. So I said at the beginning, we've got a bit of time to make a decision, so you probably do have a month, maybe 2 months to make the decision about destocking. Then you're committed. So maintain your sheep so that they are saleable in that time. If you can make the decision quicker, that's better, but if you can't make the decision, you've probably got a bit of a window, provided you're maintaining your sheep. They're still going to be valuable. But then make sure you've done the sums well enough that you can afford to keep the sheep, that you can afford to feed the sheep that you keep. So conclusions are: sell your low priority sheep, sell more if you've got limited cash flow, retaining and feeding sheep is profitable because of the high wool and meat prices. So if you can do it, it will pay. Live weight gain in confinement pays if condition score is less than 2.7. So that's a different message than because of the situation than we've had in the past. And for fatter sheep, target maintenance, unless you've got limited cash flow and limited grain availability.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that session. That was information and data packed, but some important messages there. I'd like to thank John.